who am I? I'm the man who fell in love with Henry Wilcox. Henry was born in Ohio in the late 1950s. Star of track and field, first in his class, president of the Student Body Association, as American as an Aaron Copland symphony. He married Patricia Fitzgerald while still in college, and 2 sons followed soon after, and he was on his way to a future of diligence and success and robust Episcopalianism. And if bright, young, ascendant young men should have secret urges and shameful desires, they hid those from the world, from themselves. Henry worked hard. He kept his head down and his hands to himself. Very soon, his hard work paid off and led him out of the Midwest and into the heart of American business. Also, the heart of American temptation, New York City. The Wilcox family arrived on July 3rd, 1981, which just happened to be the same summer that I arrived in the city. I arrived, as so many before me, as a refugee from a home that had become hostile to my presence. I knew from an early age that I made people uncomfortable. I was moony and effeminate, and small towns have the peculiar habit of protecting their feathery, delicate young boys, but once I got a little older, my parents took me to ministers, doctors, fitness instructors even, if you could believe it. Every walk through town seemed dangerous. Every school day held the real potential for violence. I began to surreptitiously steal the sleeping pills from my mother, planning my suicide. I had this little ritual that I would hold them in my hand every night, staring at them, until one night, perilously close to swallowing them all, I was struck by the realization that I didn't want to change. And it wasn't my nature that I hated, but my circumstances. So I left. The only place I knew to go, New York City. I'd read all about the events of June 1969. It was the only place in the world that I knew to look for young men like myself. Imagine me, 19 years old, 1981, deep in the heart of Times Square, begging strangers for directions to the Stonewall Inn. Eventually, I am given directions by a very friendly pimp, headed onto a graffiti-covered subway downtown, making my way to the Stonewall Inn, only to discover that it has since become a Chinese restaurant. Well, you can imagine my disappointment. But I was very hungry, and I'd never had Chinese food at that point in my life. So I decided to stay there at Mr. Shun's Dim Sum Emporium, and knew that I had made the right decision. Henry, meanwhile, is not quite so sure. He's 24 years old, already the father of 2 young boys, making more in a single month than most men twice his age earn in an entire year, owns a 4-bedroom house in White Plains, and commutes every day into the sinful city. There's Henry after work, knocking back martinis with colleagues. There's Henry in the steam room at the East Side Club. There's Henry on the 11:30 train headed home. There's Henry in the shower trying to expunge his dirty secret from his skin. There's Henry at 1 a.m. slipping into bed beside a wife who, let's be honest, suspects more than she lets on. We meet at a rooftop patio overlooking Christopher Street, the cliche of it all. Henry has rented an apartment in the city while his family summers in Montauk. I spot him first and am thunderstruck by the sight of him. Slightly curly chestnut hair worn a little long, as was the style at the time. Well-developed chest threatening the integrity of the polo shirt that he was wearing. I step into his line of sight, waiting to be noticed. Believe it or not, it doesn't take very long. We chat for as long as we can stand and then sneak off to Henry's apartment and to his bed. Henry was the first. The only man I ever loved. No. That is a blatant lie, and shame on me for telling it. How can I reword it? Henry was the only man that I ever needed to be loved by. It was in his gaze and from his kisses and through his touch that I first saw my own worth. I fell hard into the handsomeness of Henry Wilcox. His intelligence, his charisma, his potential. Well, no, not his potential, his certainty. I was never meant to be Henry's life partner. I was just the person he was dancing with when the music stopped. See, by this point, whispers of a disease had already graduated to rumors, and rumors swiftly became stories, and stories, unfortunately, became fact. Henry and I had arrived in New York City just in time for the party to end. We clutched together for 5 years out of comfort, out of safety, as the city burned around us. By 1987, we had had enough of funerals, of hospital visits, and sight of thousands of once vital young men just laid to waste. So we decided to move as far from civilization as we could. We eventually came across this rambling old house on a aimless country road 3 hours north of the city. Built in the late 18th century. And it's just far enough back from the road that you can imagine that you're completely alone in the world. And my favorite thing in front of the house is this gigantic cherry tree, which has been there since George Washington was out terrorizing them. It puts on the most astonishing show twice a year. In the autumn, the leaves burn deep orange and red, and the tree looks like it's on fire for over a month. And then in the springtime, the tree develops these deep, blushing blossoms, which eventually fall from the branches and cascade to the ground in this sort of aerial ballet. And I don't know if you'll believe me, but it's true. Deep in the trunk of the tree are a set of pig's teeth, put there, I don't know how many generations ago. The superstition among the colonials was that if you were to bite the bark of the tree, it would cure any ailment that you had. Sadly, pure superstition. And yet, there, in that country air, and the rolling pasture land with flowers and cherry trees with pig's teeth stuck in the bark of the tree, there was no disease. There was no loss. There was no danger. Henry bought the house the next day, and we lived there for over a year without ever leaving the property. We cooked, we cleaned, we read under the shade of the cherry tree, we gardened, and blocked out our friends and the outside world, which was easier in those days before social media. Oh, your cat is so adorable. After a year, Henry grew restless. And honestly, I'm surprised that it took that long. He went on a trip to London, the first of his many ventures, which eventually led to him becoming an extremely wealthy man. And in his absence, I began to steal. So I eventually decided to take a trip back to the city. It had been over a year since I was there, and I was terrified as to what I might find. And I was just about to take myself to lunch when I ran into an old friend of ours. Peter West was his name. Darling man. Possibly the most clever man that I ever knew, which, believe me, is saying a lot. And handsome as sin. I wouldn't have recognized him if he hadn't called out to me from the other side of Fifth Avenue. He had the look. His once beautiful face becomes sunken and sallow. His muscles had all melted away. It was clear in one look that he was infected. He was also, I found out, essentially homeless. His landlord had evicted him. And like so many of us, he was estranged from his family for many, many years, so he had nowhere to go. So we got on the next train and headed back to my house. Called a cab. When the driver arrived, he took one look at Peter and sped off. So there we were, 4 miles from my house with no way to get there except our legs. So we walked. Luckily, the day was beautiful. Peter breathed in the country air through his rattling lungs and actually smiled. And the sun was just setting as we arrived on the property, and I felt this release in Peter. I put him in one of the rooms upstairs, and he spent the next 5 days slowly dying with us. I held him as he wept in grief. I cleaned him when he fouled himself, and I comforted him as he screamed in agony. I had no idea that I had such strength. And on the 4th day, Henry arrived back from London. When I told him that I had Peter upstairs, he flew into a rage, accusing me of betrayal and inviting the plague into our house. I have never seen such fear on a man's face as I saw on Henry's that day. He got back into his car and drove away. Peter died as the sun was rising on his 5th day with us. And Henry flew back to London without so much as a word, so much as a call. I spent the first few weeks of my exile wondering, had I been wrong to show such kindness to a friend? But I'm telling you, to look into Peter's face, into those frightened eyes, if I had gone back to my place of peace, leaving him there on the sidewalk, I would have ruined that house for myself, far worse than I ever could have ruined it for Henry. I realized that hiding away in that house from our friends and from news of the outside world was the worst act of cowardice I had ever committed. The answer was not to shut the world out, but to fling open the doors and to invite it in. And so, I invited in other people that I knew in their last days and replayed that scene over and over and over and over and over with friends, acquaintances, and eventually even strangers. One by one, they came to my house, and one by one, they died there. A few months later, Henry had his lawyers write up the paperwork to make me the sole owner of the house. That house would not have become my property if it had not been for Peter West. It would not have become the blessed place that it is today if it had not first hosted his torture and death. Henry cannot see it that way, and that is for Henry to sort out. After 36 years, I think we're still sorting it out. If it is ever to be sorted.